I'm no Brad Pitt, so I brought images for y'all to look at, so which have to be made for the next 30 minutes. The Civil War began as a war to determine the fate of the Union. The high human and financial cost of the war in the second year led President Lincoln to expand the Union's national objectives to include freedom for enslaved African Americans. The Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1st, 1863, freed millions of enslaved people in the states still in rebellion as a military measure to weaken the South's ability to sustain its war effort by denying it a major portion of its labor force. The following year, General U.S. Grant, the new commander-in-chief of U.S. Army Forces, halted prisoner of war exchanges as part of his own operational strategy to subdue the South. His policy delayed freedom to tens of thousands of Union soldiers, both black and white, held in captivity in Southern military prisons. Not until 1865, when Union victory appeared likely, did Grant allow the prisoner transactions to resume. Officials selected Wilmington, North Carolina as the release site for Union prisoners. What did a new birth of freedom mean to those released prisoners, many of whom had been held in captivity for more than a year? In 1861, neither the Union nor the Confederacy was prepared to accommodate large numbers of prisoners of war. Moreover, most Americans, including President Lincoln, believed the war would be brief, and so ignored the issue of military prisons. The conflict dragged on for 4 years and proved to be far bloodier and more miserable than anyone could have imagined. Estimates of the total number of prisoners taken and fatalities while they were incarcerated vary in part because Confederate records are incomplete. The U.S. War Department estimated that 347,000 men, 220,000 Confederates, and 127,000 Federals were held in military prisons during the war. Privations on both sides included inadequate housing and provisions, poor sanitation, exposure, malnutrition, boredom, and disease. More than 49,000 prisoners died in captivity, to 26,440 Confederates, 22,580 Federals. In 1861, Confederacy and Union used an informal parole and exchange program patterned after a European system employed during the Crimean War. Officers of equal rank were exchanged for one another, while enlisted men were traded on a man-by-man basis. If an even switch was unavailable, officers were exchanged for a pre-designated number of enlisted men. For example, a major general would be worth 40 privates, a colonel was worth 15 privates, and so on. Parole, based on an oath of honor, was occasionally extended to captives when a timely exchange seemed unlikely. The system worked reasonably well. With soldiers rejoining their units were notified that they had been properly exchanged. Eventually, however, the system broke down under the sheer weight of the vast number of soldiers that were taken prisoner. On July the 22nd, 1862, the two sides adopted a formal program of exchange known as the Dix Hill Cartel, named for its principal negotiators, Union Major John Dix, seen there on the left, and Confederate General Daniel Harvey Hill, who had been the former superintendent of the North Carolina Military Institute in Charlotte. Lincoln was leery of any deals that might give the impression that his government recognized the legitimacy of the Confederate States of America. So there were complications with this cartel from the very beginning, and he certainly didn't want to entice European nations to consider recognizing and then intervening on behalf of the Confederacy. So the Dix Hill Cartel was controversial from the beginning. It survived, in fact, only 5 months. In December 1862, U.S. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton suspended it in response to a proclamation by President Jefferson Davis that branded Major General Benjamin F. Butler an outlaw for actions committed against civilians in New Orleans under federal occupation. The following May, the Confederate Congress passed a resolution decreeing that African American combatants, now being recruited by the U.S. Army, would be treated as fugitive slaves when captured and returned to bondage, while their white officers would be arrested for attempting to incite servile insurrection. As soon as this became known to President Lincoln, he personally postponed exchanges of officers as a necessary preparative to meet the threatened purpose of Mr. Davis. Even so, exchange of enlisted men continued. Some transactions of prisoners continued into early 1864 under the supervision of General Butler, the Commissioner of Exchange. He released invalid soldiers, non-combatants, and, quote, special case prisoners. But Butler's activities were small, controversial, and unsatisfactory, particularly to the Confederacy. They pressed to have the Dix-Hill cartel resumed, having completely tapped out their white manpower pool for recruits. The South desperately needed a steady flow of released prisoners to refill the ranks that were now depleted as a result of the war. We have made a proposition after proposition, both under the cartel and outside of it, but with little effect, lamented Judge Robert Ould, who was the Confederate Commissioner of Exchange. Things changed when General Grant became U.S. Army Commander-in-Chief in March of 1864. Grant believed the South could be defeated through a war of attrition, slowly but surely wearing down its armies and civilian support by exploiting the overwhelming manpower and resources at his disposal. He battled General Robert E. Lee's army around Petersburg, Virginia, in that way for 10 months, 1864 to 1865. In keeping with the attrition strategy, Grant halted all prisoner of war exchanges as of August the 22nd, 1864. Quote, "It is hard on our men held in Southern prisons not to be exchanged," the general admitted, "but it is humanity to those left in the ranks to fight our battles. Every man released on parole or otherwise becomes an active soldier against us once again, either directly or indirectly. If we commence a system of exchange which liberates all prisoners taken, we will have to fight on until the whole South is exterminated." So the demands of war dictated that freedom for prisoners be delayed in exchange for a shorter conflict and fewer casualties on both the battlefront and the home front. President Lincoln remained largely silent on the topic. He could not quibble with Grant's view that a prisoner exchange moratorium was a smart move militarily. Released prisoners would greatly benefit the enemy at once, but threatened General Sherman's ongoing operations in Georgia and Grant's campaign against Lee's army in northern Virginia. So the demands of war had influenced Lincoln's own policy regarding slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, you will remember, was issued as a military strategy, intended to encourage African Americans to continue to effect their own freedom and deny the Southern Army much needed workers. The President believed it would weaken the South's war effort. Grant expected similar results by suspending prisoner exchanges. Two issues prompted President Lincoln to reconsider his stance. First, European delegates meeting in Geneva, Switzerland in August of 1864 had established international rules regarding prisoners of war. Article 15 of the Geneva Accord mandated that wounded and sick soldiers should be collected, cared for, and protected, though they may become prisoners. The United States also signed the agreement. Second, growing public outrage over reports of inhumane conditions in Southern military prisons, harsh treatment, and acts of retaliation against captives gravely concerned the President both from a humanitarian and a political standpoint. Newspaper accounts revived public interest in prisoner of war and had the effect of slowly but surely weakening the government's policy. The poet, Walt Whitman, was particularly critical of the administration, calling Secretary of War Edwin Stanton's program, or lack thereof, cold-blooded. In mid-October 1864, the President gave General Grant full authority to set prisoner exchange policy, but encouraged him to do all that he could to bring the boys in blue home. Quote, "It is the desire of the President," Secretary Stanton informed Grant, "that no effort consistent with national safety and honor be spared to effect the prompt release of all soldiers in captivity as prisoners of war." Confederate authorities freely admitted that conditions inside their prisons had deteriorated, and the misery of captives increased since the suspension of the Dix-Hill cartel. Camps were bursting at the seams with an overabundance of prisoners who were suffering terribly as a result. It is true, "Your prisoners are suffering," Judge Gould informed General Grant. Responding on January 13, 1865, to a new proposal by Judge Gould to trade prisoners, General Grant replied that he, quote, "considered it just and equally fair and beneficial to both sides." He instructed that arrangements be made for the exchange of 3,000 prisoners each week, or as many as can be delivered on each side. This was a vast departure from his earlier stance. By then, however, Grant believed the course of the war had turned decidedly in favor of the Union. Federal forces occupied most southern states, with the fighting of real consequence occurring only in Virginia and the Carolinas. General Sherman had marched across Georgia to the sea and captured Savannah in December 1864, and Admiral David Porter and General Alfred H. Terry's campaign against Fort Fisher in Wilmington was well underway. The turn of events inspired Grant to change his course on prisoner exchanges. The Confederate government was elated with Grant's decision. Sherman's conquest of Georgia had caused authorities to abandon Andersonville and transfer tens of thousands of Union captives to prison camps in Columbia, Florence, South Carolina, and Salisbury, North Carolina. Now Sherman was poised to advance northward from Savannah, forcing the Confederates to relocate prisoners from Columbia and Florence to Charlotte, Wilmington, Raleigh, and Salisbury. Conditions at Salisbury were particularly bad. Opened in December 1861, the camp was designed to hold 2,500 prisoners. Twice that number of men were being held there by the time Grant suspended exchanges in August of 1864. When prisoners from Andersonville arrived at Salisbury later that summer, the camp's population swelled to almost 9,000, and mortality rates increased dramatically. An ill-advised, poorly planned escape plot by a large number of captives on November 25th led to the shooting deaths and wounding of about 250 men, including Confederate guards. Freedom had become just another word to the desperate prisoners, and they had nothing left to lose, with a nod to Chris Christopherson and Janice Joplin. To prevent future outbreaks of violence, Governor Vance sent Bradley Johnson to Salisbury. General Johnson's first report to the governor clearly revealed his eagerness to parole the thousands of prisoners who were consuming Army rations and keeping Confederate soldiers from the battlefront where they were needed. With Grant now on board for a new prisoner of war cartel, only the details needed to be worked out. On February 14th, Judge Gould and General Grant officially agreed to a wholesale exchange of prisoners. Gould offered to deliver all federal prisoners to either Richmond or Wilmington. They designated City Point, Virginia, as the place of exchange for Confederate prisoners and Wilmington for Union prisoners. The selection of Wilmington was merely a matter of convenience. Prisoners currently being held in Florence, Raleigh, Charlotte, and Salisbury could be transferred there by rail without disrupting the transportation needs of the Confederate Army. 1,500 prisoners from Florence had already been transported to Wilmington to prevent them from falling into the hands of Sherman's army. The seaport also provided good facilities for shipping the released prisoners by steamship to the north. Confederate General Robert Hoke disapproved of Wilmington as an exchange point for Union prisoners. "It will not do to make this a depot for prisoners," General Hoke, the field commander at Wilmington, told the Assistant Secretary of War. He insisted that the arrival of more Union prisoners at Wilmington would only hinder his ability to defend the city against a determined Union combined operation now underway. General John Schofield commanded 15,000 troops, and Admiral Porter a flotilla of gunboats determined to capture Wilmington to assist General Sherman's Carolinas campaign. So Hoke's protest fell on deaf ears. On February 19th, the chagrined General Hoke informed General Schofield, Union commander at Wilmington, that he was prepared to turn over 1,500 prisoners of war. Schofield surprised Hoke by delaying 24 hours before responding to his communique and then declining to accept the prisoners. He knew that caring for such a large number of them would impede his campaign to capture the city. Better that Hoke deal with them. Besides, Schofield had received no word from his superiors about an exchange cartel. "We are greatly embarrassed by the prisoners," the the enemy refusing to receive them or entertain any proposition. General Braxton Bragg, Department of North Carolina commander. Until Schofield agreed to accept the prisoners, Bragg had little choice but to evacuate them along with the Confederate Army in government stores from Wilmington. Taking up valuable cargo space on the train cars, prisoners were transported up the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad and placed in temporary camps scattered from Burgall Station to Goldsboro. In the meantime, prisoners were on their way to the exchange point from camps throughout the Carolinas. More than 5,000 from Salisbury were marched to Greensboro, where they boarded train cars for the trip to the coast. Almost half of the prisoners, however, many of them desperately ill, were sent directly to Richmond for release. 1,200 Union officers were shipped from Columbia to Wilmington. The trains transported 600 prisoners from Raleigh to Goldsboro, only 100 miles from the seaport, until authorities resolved the miscommunication between Hoke and Schofield about the exchange. A total of 6,000 prisoners came out of Florence, South Carolina. Many of them had been transported from Andersonville. Civilians complained loudly about the lack of discipline Confederate guards exercised over their captives. Shabby Union soldiers, they claimed, fled their captors, straggled on the streets of the towns, and generally annoyed residents. Catherine Ann Edmonston, the secession lady diarist from Halifax County, reported that, quote, the sufferings of the Yankee prisoners on their backward route are represented as being very great, but we are not to blame. It was not in our power to alleviate it. Union authorities had refused to exchange for them, hence, quote, their suffering. On the heads of their own government and countrymen be it, she exclaimed. Our hands are clean. With the exception of Mrs. Edmonston, few civilians commented on the 1865 prisoner of war exchange in North Carolina, perhaps guilt-ridden that not more had been done to mitigate this captive suffering or the Confederate Army's unwillingness to allow civilians to aid in their care. Indeed, one prisoner from Florence noted that hundreds of men, women, children, both black and white, appeared one morning near their holding den in downtown Wilmington before the evacuation, carrying baskets of food and drink for the destitute Federal soldiers, only to be turned away by Confederate authorities. When Union forces captured Wilmington on February the 22nd, 1865, they encountered about 200 escaped prisoners emerging from their hiding places. Taking advantage of the confusion and chaos surrounding the Confederate evacuation, some captives audaciously jumped off overcrowded train cars and snuck away from holding dens. Perhaps inspired by the tens of thousands of African Americans who had rushed to freedom inside Union lines in eastern North Carolina since its occupation in 1862, Union prisoners in Wilmington also effected their own freedom. They concealed themselves in and about town, often with the assistance of African Americans. The Negroes are our true friend, observed one Union escapee. Even some white residents clandestinely helped Union prisoners of war. The white people of the town were very friendly to the escaped prisoners and took us into their homes and fed us well, commented George Weiser of the 10th New Jersey Volunteers, who had been confined at Andersonville. At the time that he captured Wilmington, General Schofield had received General Grant's official memorandum about the exchange cartel. He notified General Hoke on February the 23rd that he was now authorized to receive the prisoners and suggested a point near General Terry's advanced post along the northeast Cape Fear River, 9 miles above the city. Schofield instructed his officers to make preparations to receive the prisoners and appointed General Joseph C. Abbott to supervise the exchange. Abbott sent commissary stores out to General Terry's encampment with instructions for soldiers to cook rations in anticipation of the prisoners' arrival. Vacant houses and buildings in Wilmington were also ready to accommodate the anticipated large number of captives. Schofield also sent an urgent appeal to the U.S. Sanitary Commission in New York to lend all the assistance that it could. Deliveries of the Union prisoners in Wilmington began on a rainy Sunday morning, February 26, 1865. The men were taken by train to Rocky Point at the intersection of the Duplin Road and the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, about 2 miles from the northeast Cape Fear River. Colonel W.H. Hatch, Confederate Assistant Agent of Exchange, Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Mulford, Federal Commissioner.
10 minutes.
Thank you. Made sure that each man was counted as he disembarked from the cars. A squad of General Terry's soldiers was dispatched to greet them, standing at present arms as the former captives passed into the zone of freedom. What did renewed freedom look and sound like? Great rejoicing erupted among the liberated prisoners who ran about, shouting, whooping, laughing, crying, rolling on the ground, and hugging each other. I felt so happy, one soldier exclaimed, that I ran and jumped the best I could and tried to shout, but no sound would come. I was so overjoyed. Many soldiers declared it the happiest day of their life. A.O. Abbott recalled that the men cheered for General Grant, Sherman, Lincoln, and General Exchange, all voting that the latter personages was, quote, the biggest general of the whole. Items that earlier held intrinsic value, tin cups, articles of clothing, morsels of food, suddenly became worthless. The released prisoners gladly discarded them along the roadside or tossed them into the adjoining fields and woods. So long as there was any doubt in our minds that the exchange might miscarry, we held on to those little worldly possessions, exclaimed a soldier. But now, all doubt vanished. We reduced our impediments unceremoniously. Organized into a column, most of the freedmen marched from the point of exchange to General Terry's encampment at Northeast Station, 2 miles away. Some too weak to walk had to be carried on litters or in wagons. As they approached the river, soldiers at the head of the line spotted Old Glory and an arched arbor of evergreens decorated with flags and a placard that read, "Welcome, brothers." A great cheer went up, which rippled along the column like the swell of an ocean wave. Again and again, every man cheered until he was exhausted and hoarse, recalled one former prisoner. The band of the 6th Connecticut Infantry played "Hail to the Chief" and "Home Sweet Home" as the soldiers passed underneath the arbor and through the 6th Connecticut's campsite. When the released prisoners crossed a pontoon bridge that spanned the Northeast Cape Fear River, General Terry's entire corps turned out to greet them. The troops drew up in a receiving line, facing the road, welcoming and congratulating the men, and offering words of sympathy and encouragement. Standard bearers unfurled flags of the corps' regiments from Connecticut, New Hampshire, New York, and Pennsylvania, which were heartily cheered by the returning soldiers from those respective states. The United States colored troops also displayed their emblems. We also found our true friend, the colored man, not as a slave, but as a man and a comrade in royal blue and fighting for a flag that never, until President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, had protected him, observed John Adams, the 19th Massachusetts, and a former prisoner of war. The necessity of caring for liberated prisoners of war exhausted local resources and threatened the health of the community and taxed the administrative duties of union officials. The periods of confinement, exposure, and neglect had taken a heavy toll on the exchange prisoners. Many of them were sick, dying, or dead by the time they reached Norrington. Approximately 200 prisoners died en route. As unprepared as the Federals were to receive such a large number of ex-prisoners, they were even less prepared for their horrible physical condition. Witnesses declared that words utterly failed to describe their appearance. Many of them were little more than skeletons with drawn, pale skin and matted hair, expressionless faces, and wearing ragged clothing. If spooks or specters could be seen, declared one Union soldier, I could imagine them to be the truest representatives of many of the returning prisoners. They were human ghosts. A doctor observed that many of the men were in a state of mind resembling idiocy, unable to tell their names. Some of them moved about on their hands and buttocks. Others giggled and smirked and hobbled like starved idiots. The soldier swore that he would never forget the mingled surprise, pity, disgust, and indignation he experienced on meeting these wretched creatures. Manhood seemed extinguished, he said. Exchanged prisoners came in at a rate of about 1,400 per day for 7 consecutive days. Captives taken by General Hope during the Wilmington campaign and General William Hardee's Carolinas campaign were also delivered. When the deliveries ended on March 4th, 7,692 enlisted men and 99 officers were taken in the northeast Cape Fear River. An additional group of 1,050 from Florence were taken in at the Brunswick River west of Wilmington.
Excuse me? 5 minutes?
Thank you. People and organizations provided the men with the best relief at hand. Union surgeons attended to their medical needs. Military sutlers and citizens took pity on the ex-prisoners and sought to mitigate their suffering. Some residents even invited soldiers into their own homes. The Wilmington Theater, today's failing call, staged a benefit for soldiers, raising $1,074, about $18,000 in today's money, for the former prisoners. On March 19th, the U.S. Sanitary Commission agents arrived in Wilmington and assumed responsibility for their care. These efforts helped a majority of the ill soldiers recover, but others were not so fortunate. 46 released captives died in Wilmington during the first week of March. The Sanitary Commission estimated that on March 20th, 15 hospitals in Wilmington housed 2,500 invalid former prisoners, more than 1/4 of the total number exchanged. Perhaps several hundred of them, many of their names unknown, died by the time the war ended in April. Despite the feeble condition of many of the prisoners, more than 7,000 of them were fit enough or had recovered physically by the end of March to be shipped home to the north. Civil War prisoners became pawns in a high-stakes game of war-making and politics. Similar to President Lincoln's policy regarding freedom for slaves as a military measure, General Grant instituted a hard policy that delayed freedom for prisoners of war as part of his military strategy for winning the war. As freedom faded, one prisoner commented that they left us here to die. But as public and political pressure grew on the Lincoln administration and the War Department, and the light at the end of the tunnel of war grew brighter, General Grant shifted his policy to help restore freedom to the beleaguered prisoners. One story perfectly illustrates the excitement and anticipation of the prisoners' return to where freedom reigned. As boxcars carrying thousands of them rolled from Florence to Wilmington, the prisoners spotted Union soldiers standing guard along the railroad tracks. "God, boys, it's our pickets!" exclaimed Ezra Ripple of the 52nd Pennsylvania Infantry. "It's all right, boys. We'll be there soon. We'll be in God's country again. Brace up now, and you will live to see them all at home again." The prisoners soon reached the point of exchange and eagerly pressed disembarked train cars. They pushed too much to satisfy a Confederate guard who tried to keep them back by pointing his rifle, musket, and bayonet at them. As soon as he did, however, a Union soldier close by brought his own gun and bayonet down and pointed it at the Southerner, warning him, in language not elegant, but most expressive, not to dare touch one of those men again. That day had gone by.